Good morning, everyone. My name is Anya Sitharam, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this session, Soaring Humanitarian Needs and Limited Resources, Engaging Non-Traditional Donors and New Sources of Financing. And that's exactly what we're going to be discussing over the next 75 minutes. Before we begin, just some quick housekeeping slides. I'm sure some of you are already very familiar with it, but just so you can see, we have the Wi-Fi there, the password EHF 2023. Please do share your thoughts on Twitter and do hashtag everyone. Interpretation, English, French, and Spanish. Next slide, please. Mobile phone. Please put your cell phone in silent mode. And finally, there's an exhibition. So don't forget to visit the exhibition, which is just outside there. I feel like I'm a sort of airline stewardess doing a safety demonstration. But anyway, that's over now, so thank you very much. OK, let's move to the topic. Why do we need new funding streams? Well, picture in your minds the United States of America. Do you know how many people live there? Well, before you reach for Google, I'll tell you the answer. It's nearly 332 million people. But according to the Global Humanitarian Overview, 339 million people, more than the population of America, will need humanitarian protection this year. And that's an increase of 65 million since the beginning of 2022. We all know that needs are outpacing spending. Despite $24 billion in donations, there's a 60% funding gap. And it's the most vulnerable who are being affected, particularly women and girls. And here's another statistic. The 10 largest donors of humanitarian assistance provide over 80% of the funding. So how do we widen that funding pool? Not just countries, but financial institutions and the private sector. How do we bring more of them to the table? Should the wealthier states have to pay mandatory contributions towards humanitarian assistance? Should there be an independently managed humanitarian fund? And these are just some of the questions and solutions that our expert panelists will be discussing. And I'm going to introduce them now. I'm delighted that they're able to join me. So we are joined by His Excellency Abdullah Al Rabia, Supervisor General of the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center. Welcome. Diana Yancey, State Secretary to the Minister for International Cooperation and Foreign Trade. Jan Egeland, Secretary General for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Uti Klammert, Deputy Executive Director, Partnerships and Advocacy for the World Food Programme. And Per Heggenes, CEO of the IKEA Foundation. Thank you very much. So we're going to start with some comments from each of the speakers, and then later on we will have a question and answer session, and do ask your questions from the floor. So when I ask you, it's very difficult to see. We have roving mics. Stand up, raise your hands, and I'll take a few at a time, and hopefully we can have a very lively conversation, and hopefully our panelists will be able to answer you. So let me start then with His Excellency Abdullah Al Rabia. The King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center response to humanitarian crisis combines funding, partnership with UN family organizations, and bilateral in-kind relief. Can you share a concrete experience that can contribute to broaden that base of funding?
Well, first of all, good morning to all of you, and thank you for the introduction. Let me start by echoing what you have said related to the widening gap between funding and also increasing humanitarian needs. And there is no question that 90% of that is being actually provided by the 10 top donors. EU and Saudi Arabia actually in the last several years have been in the top 5 donors globally. But this cannot continue because what's in each pledging, we look at there is a pressure on those 10 countries and nothing beyond. So let me share with you some of the ideas that we have done in KS Relief, and I think some ideas of myself. At the Kingdom, we have, since the inception of KS Relief, we have started to go beyond the government funding, and we have incorporated the private sector and also the fundraising programs. And like the last tragedy, which is the earthquake, which has happened in Syria and Turkey, both the private sector and the public have all actually matched the government funding or vice versa. And we believe that we have to add many ideas. One, it is a mandate for all of us to widen the donor group. It is a duty of each country to encourage friendly countries. It's the duty of each actually league to put pressure on also other countries. And I'm sure in the world there are more than 10 countries which are wealthy. There are probably triple that number of countries that shy from pledging events or participate actually with a small number. Secondly, I think we have also to encourage the private sector, and I'm glad that we have one of them with us. But I think the private sector is very important participant that should be stimulated and encouraged to participate. And we shouldn't forget also the public participation. But I have also something to add. If we look at the triple nexus, we always talk about humanitarian development and we forgot peace. What have we done for the peace? Probably little. We see many conflicts which are actually draining 2/3 of our resources, and little efforts done by the international community and the United Nations to make a serious efforts to stop conflicts. Saudi Arabia has done activities that are hoping to bring stability in the region for Yemen and hopefully for Syria and Lebanon and Iraq. But we want to go beyond that, especially now we are in the EU region. I think there is also a mandate for the international community to also put a lot of efforts to bring peace to Ukraine and other parts of the world. This is one. Second, we have not talked about the logistic costs. There is an escalating increase in the prices of humanitarian supplies, and we have done little to review that. And I have talked to our partners in the UN. The costs are increasing yearly, but we have to find ways to decrease those costs. I was thinking something out of the box. I thought on my way to this meeting is why not to think about a new forms of taxation for humanitarian purposes. Taxation on the ads, taxation on transport or tickets, something that we could do it optional or maybe initially, but we have to really think out of the box. Every time, like yesterday, pledging event, collect from the top donors and then stop. And the gap will be wider. So we have to think out of the box. And I'm sure there are scientists, researchers who can have ideas better than me and can bring it to the table. I think I covered that part. I don't know whether you mentioned the in-kind donations or that's...
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. One of the things that we have done in Saudi Arabia is the food recycling. At least in the region, we have a lot of food wastage, and I'm sure in the EU and North America, there is a lot of food wastage. But how much the research and innovation have done to recycle that food and use it again? I'm sure there is lots of food which has been wasted, billions of dollars or euros that has been wasted. In Saudi Arabia, we have several NGOs which has done innovative ways with science, evidence, safety to recycle the food. I'm sure there are equal efforts in the region, but we have to make it global. And one of the ideas also, since we have the private sector with us, is the humanitarian industry. We haven't done a lot of efforts on the humanitarian industry. And we have at KS Relief, we have actually a project as we speak, which is a partnership between the private sector, KS Relief, and the government to introduce the food industry. Let me give you an example. We have in Saudi Arabia dates, which has a lot of actually food content, or actually a lot of calories, vitamins, and you name it. And we are stimulating the private sector to use those fruits in the industry. I'm sure there is lots of waste in the plants, for example, apples, oranges, you name it. We have to think out of the box to put, for example, a humanitarian industry that is cost effective and can be used in a partnership with the UN, with the NGOs like the Norwegian Council or others, that will bring prices which are affordable, and we can also move forward. I guess I'll stop here and then let others also, because otherwise I'll be taking all of your time.
Well, it's great to hear you absolutely bursting with ideas, and the idea, therefore, of taxation somehow or the other, but it would need to be discussed on something, maybe airline tickets, I don't know, anywhere within countries or more international. Also, the fact that you are working very closely with the private sector to get them to really participate in this. Thank you so much. I'd now like to bring in Diana Janse, State Secretary to Minister for International Cooperation and Foreign Trade, Sweden. Sweden, of course, we all know, has been a long and important actor in the humanitarian aid, and is one of the largest humanitarian donors in the world. So the call for more resources and resonates loud and clear, but how do we actually stimulate collective engagement? How do you get other people, other countries to be just as generous?
Well, thank you. And good morning, everybody. I think I will, to a large extent, echo what Dr. Al-Rabieh said. I mean, I think we all agree that it's both essential and urgent to expand the donor base to bridge the growing gap between humanitarian needs and funding. This is also why we have identified as one of our key priorities in the humanitarian field during our EU presidency. And I think today's panel discussion is therefore very welcome. The time has come to collectively step up our efforts to meet the extreme challenges of the humanitarian system is facing. And it is, as Dr. Al-Rabieh pointed out, it's not sustainable that the 10 largest donors of humanitarian aid alone provide, I have 82% in my paper, but I heard you mention 90%. I've seen both figures, but regardless, it's really the lion part of that. And we provide this funding year after year. But to stimulate collective engagement and generate more resources, I think we need to reach out to friends and partners in Asia and Latin America, particularly among the G20 countries and OECD countries. They have the financial means to step up, and we see how much it means, like Saudi Arabia, that has in recent years really been a key donor and a key partner. Secondly, we need to intensify our dialogue with development actors and international financial institutions and see how they can better fit into this context of working in the most fragile and conflict-affected states. By 2030, 2/3 of the world's population in extreme poverty will live in these places, and many deep and protracted crises has caused needs to scale up far beyond what humanitarian actors can address. So I'm really curious to hear also the views on this particular issue from Per it's quite unique to have the private sector represented in this way. So I think we all want to take this opportunity to hear how we can entice you and your colleagues to take part in this important work. Thirdly, we need to scale up anticipatory action and do more, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected countries with high climate vulnerability, as we heard this morning. Only 12% of funding from multilateral climate fund goes to fragile and conflict-affected states. It's like in a place like Somalia that I visited a couple of months ago with the worst drought in decades. And these droughts are clearly climate induced. It's less than 5%. We need to make climate financing more accessible and available in such places. So these are some ideas. And I also think, like Dr. Al-Rabieh said, we need to get out of this humanitarian silo and look what can be done far beyond. We cannot just simply accept the fact that these the needs are growing year after year after year. So what can be done? And we had a conversation, Jan and I, earlier this morning. It's like thinking also, so are we might have to double down or triple down or quadruple down on mediation efforts, because a lot of these humanitarian needs are conflicts are the key drivers. So what can be done outside this particular context? What can be done in the international system? What can be done on diplomacy, mediation, etc.? I think I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, let's move on now to Jan Egeland from the Norwegian Refugee Council. So we've heard there, humanitarian needs are soaring, but the donor base is narrow. So what do you think we should do to address that funding gap?
We have to do a lot because the gap is not stable. It's widening, and it's widening on our watch. In 2022, humanitarians had to decide which families to feed and which families to give relief to and which ones to cast aside. This year, it's going to be worse. I'm really worried for 2023, and I'm even more worried for 2024. There was only 10 donors, as you've commented, but 50% nearly of all humanitarian funding comes from one donor, the United States. I mean, we're reliant on a vote in the US Congress to avoid having a free fall in humanitarian work. That's the realities at the moment. I'm an old man, much older than Diana and others here. In the 1980s and 90s, I participated in similar panels. And what did we say? Oh, there are only 10 humanitarian donors. Where are the non-traditional donors? There is a growing world economy. How come we are so few donors? Where's the private sector? Fast forward 30, 40 years, and we're still in the same situation. So
we're in Groundhog Day.
Yes, I mean, so we need now to reboot. And a couple of proposals. Yes, on your initial question here, should there be a more firm responsibility sharing? Yes, there should. There's not 10 strong economies in the world. There are 50, 60 really strong economies. Many countries that are much richer than my country, Norway, was when we implemented 0.7% of gross national income in foreign assistance. They are much more rich per capita than we were at the time, and they give nothing, really. I mean, they give a little sum here and a little sum there, some symbolic stuff. I think we have to call them out, really. These are 30, 40, 50 countries that are not sharing the burden to feed and care for and protect and educate children. Should there be an assist system through the UN? I mean, let's find the system. Yes, perhaps. We should find a way for that. I saw a colleague from ACF, Pierre Micheletti, had the figure that if the 50, 60 countries in the high income category of the World Bank shared cost for 100% funding of all humanitarian needs, how much would it be per country? 0.03 to 0.07, depending on the year. It's nothing really, and these are countries having Olympics and world championships and putting satellites up and out of space at an enormous rate. They can pay, they can help save children in the hour of greatest need. Second idea is we need to understand that more than 30% of the situations of emergency are so protracted that it is ridiculous to treat them with 1 year humanitarian budgets only. Organizations like my own too much have 1 year to the next year funding. But we've been in Somalia for 40 years. We've been in Afghanistan for equally long. We've been in Congo for equally long, and so on. So the international financial institutions that have vast sums at their disposal, many of the development actors, etc., have to sit down and make a real plan for the next 5, 6, 7 years to turn things around. Provide livelihoods, provide durable solutions. Let's sit together, we who are on the ground, mostly humanitarian organizations, in all of the villages, many of them are local humanitarian organizations, and the big funding agents. And then I also, and that will be Nexus, moving from seminars to really action for people in the field. Finally, I do agree with Diana here on the shrinking of the needs. We need to also reboot not only climate mitigation as solidarity with the frontline nations in climate change, but also in terms of conflict resolution, conflict efforts. There are too many places where there is no real conflict work, where the regional powers and the international powers are fueling these conflicts. If we could have a reboot also of conflict resolution, I think it really would help, because the way it's going now, the gap is widening.
It's interesting to see three of you talking about peace building and conflict resolution. Before you put your microphone down, I just wanted to come up with a follow-up, just a very quick follow-up question, because you talked there, you were alluding to sort of benchmarking, having some kind of means or mechanism of making the richest countries pay 0.07% of their GDP. But really, that's coming out of taxation. That's ordinary people in these countries would be funding that ultimately. So how do we reach out to ordinary people, members of the public? How do we get that humanitarian narrative out there?
Well, I think we have to realize that there is a lot of economic growth across the world, really. Life expectancy in many countries has gone from 30 years to 70 years. There is a lot of nations who have, again, a standard of living which is up there. That's when some of these 10 humanitarian donors started to become massive donors. So I think it has to be public decisions, government decisions. There has to be a system making them predictably fund. I mean, we also have so-called non-traditional donors that come with generous funds, 1 year a lot, next year nothing, then a lot again, etc. We need predictable funding year on year, or 1 year after the other, for these places where people starve the year there is no funding.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to give you a quick resume of one of the warm-up sessions that was held prior to this conference. And this was held in the Middle East and Eastern neighborhood, and it was a warm-up session on this very topic. It was held in Amman and the EU premises, and it was again about engaging non-traditional donors and new sources of funding. More than 120 participants from 50 institutions, and they represented local and international civil society organizations, UN agencies, government representatives, Red Cross, Crescent Movement, and they all took part in a discussion, and I'm just going to very quickly list some of their conclusions, and one of them was to explore the viability of humanitarian impact bonds, which could allow private investors to support humanitarian initiatives. They also talked about risk financing insurance and garnering private sector support, for instance, in employing vulnerable individuals to supply specialized low-skilled labor, again, to promote socio-economic development, and importantly, innovative financing mechanisms should support localization. So those were the conclusions of a warm-up session held in Amman. I'm going to bring in Uti Klamet, Deputy Executive Director, Partnerships and Advocacy from the World Food Programme. So the World Food Programme has a long track record of engagement with governments, corporations and individuals. Could you illustrate some of the concrete examples of the way you are engaging with governments?
Anja, thank you very much. This is a super critical and important question for us because closing the so-called funding gap is so stressful for us at the moment because, I mean, the case and the caseload was already highlighted also in your introduction. So the question really is, how do we respond to this kind of increase of humanitarian needs, and how are we breaking through this vicious cycle, also investing into anticipatory action, resilience, climate adaptation. So that's the way how we should go about. I want to surprise you with the diversification of funding resources. We have all of a sudden, we have Somalia, Haiti and Pakistan amongst the top donors. And I'm very often asked, how come? No, people looking at our annual report and our kind of feedback, how did that happen? It's very interesting. And the reason is, and what was not mentioned, hunger is the most solvable problem. So what SDGs are suggesting is putting national governments in the driver's seat. So we have all of a sudden developed, I call it a business model, how to engage with national governments, putting national governments in the center and really challenging that, saying it's your opportunity and it's also your ownership. You have to drive that agenda. Because we can talk, Jan, a lot about diversification of funding resources, but time is working against us. It will take some time. In the here and now, what we see is that Somalia and Haiti have decided to use either IMF money or World Bank money. In the case of Afghanistan, we are using also international financing institution, World Bank money, and these resources are part of the new diversification pathway. So I'm just saying the international financing institutions are really engaging with the national governments, really encouraging them to deal with the food security issue. The World Bank allocated 30 billion. IMF has, in a way, really made it possible that there is a food security fast response facility. We are very, very much in appreciating what is happening. But the national governments, they have to take the decision whether they want to use this money and asking the UN system, and it's not only about World Food Programme, but asking the implementers in fragile settings in their own country to help and build systems so that we are breaking through the vicious cycle in terms of food distribution. We are investing a lot in social protection systems. We are investing a lot in new technology, cash-based transfers. When the shock response phase is over, that we can hand over, and that's the route to go. So my pledge is that we need, and the question is also, what is the role of traditional donors? Let's please move away from the term traditional donors. Let's work more towards the kind of long-standing donors, and the long-standing donors have the political responsibility as well to speak with national governments and really recall the SDG 2 agenda, saying that's your responsibility. It's also the responsibility dealing with internally displaced people. It's the national responsibility, and it's also a national responsibility to deal with refugees in the respective countries with the help of international donors to deal with the additional shock response and build the resilience. So I'm really want to make that kind of pitch, saying we have to think in the diversification of funding resources, that we put national governments in the forefront and really encourage them, also discussing with the international financing institutions, also the kind of investment for climate resilience infrastructure, all the kind of the whole debate about global public goods, dealing with food security. And I have to say that's for us very promising. And if you ask me, Anja, in 5 years, being again here on the panel, I hope that we have even more diversification, seeing more donors on that list. My last word is Pakistan. That's the best model. Pakistan was taking its own money, 200 million, and was really investing in a huge malnutrition program. And if you look into the kind of public spending in terms of social protection, it's for us the route to go. That's the conceptual idea, and that is also hope for donors, that we can offer you some of the solutions together with national governments, saying here's a way out, and here is your political part, talking to national governments and saying, you have also to work towards political solutions with our long-standing donors. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, that's so interesting about hearing about the diversification of the funding pool and the donors there. And we were just talking a bit before the panel, and I had just made a very short film about the Pakistan's investment in its social security system. It's called SHAS, which means empathy in Urdu. And it's extraordinary. And it's you really wouldn't imagine a country like Pakistan, which has so many problems and the flooding issues, etc., would be thinking so far ahead. But I just very wanted to come back to you, Uti, just about this. What's the downside to these countries taking money from the IMF or whatever? Is it a loan or a grant? Does it make them dependent going on? How does that work?
Of course, it's their kind of decision. A national government has 3 options. Either they take their own money, they're using donor money, or they're using IFI money. So that's the decision tree. That's very simple. And I think, using the IFI money has in a particular way also a kind of exit strategy, because it's coming along with a lot of indicators saying, after 5 years, after 3 years, there is also the technical advisory and the capacity building component accompanying the loan or the grant. And that's the component. And we have to, in a way, negotiate on exactly that component. It's not about, the cash flow into, in terms of using loans and grants. It's in particular the technical advisory component, part of the contract, doing, for example, in very, carrying out in very difficult contexts like Lebanon, for example, the verification and the targeting process. Who is entitled to get social protection, cash transfer from the social protection system? I'm sure in the audience you know how difficult that is in terms of verifying again and again and again, the list of the target group. But in the moment you are carrying that out and you, in a way, create transparency, then you can also see the kind of success stories, how you bring down the needs over time. And that's the incentive for national governments to really go this loan and grant route.
Thank you very much. So we're going to go to Per Heggenes, CEO of the IKEA Foundation, and it's wonderful to have you here as the representative of the private sector, which we rarely have on panels, so welcome, thank you so much. So you've heard what people are saying, and we really want to talk about, what other steps are needed to unlock more private sector capital in the humanitarian field.
Thank you, Anja. Before I do that, can I talk a little bit about the root causes of human suffering and the fact what's going on in the world today? Because we all see the war in Ukraine, we see the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, but maybe the most important driver of human suffering today is climate change. And the driving of displacement in the global south is tremendous, and the biggest driver for human suffering in the future will be the impact of climate change. The millions of people who are displaced from their lives, from their houses, from their areas because they can't make a living anymore. And climate change is happening in the global north and not in the global south. The global south is the part of the world where people have contributed the least to climate change but are suffering the most. So unless we invest significant amount of money in mitigation, the little adaptation money that goes to sub-Saharan Africa that Diana was talking about is not going to help, and we can put more and more money into adaptation, but the real root cause is the mitigation side, is the climate change, the emissions that's happening in the global north. So let's not forget about that, because that's taking us to an existential crisis in this world, and if we can't really fix that, everything else is not going to be very important. It won't be a livable planet left for us to live on. Okay, private sector. Let me start by just saying that private sector, I define the private sector, for the purpose of this discussion, in two buckets. It's the part of the private sector that creates economic growth, that creates jobs, that drives economic development, and then we have the foundations which I represent. So let me talk about the private sector on the first part, the economic growth private sector, because I think that's the biggest untapped potential in this whole discussion that we have about humanitarian suffering. I think we talk about how can we get more money into humanitarian aid, and Jan's reflections are amazing when you think about the potential that's there to do much more with the money that should be available. But I think the private sector is not the source of money for humanitarian aid. The least effective thing you can do with the private sector is to ask them for a check. The private sector should be engaged with their ingenuity, their entrepreneurship, their network, their ability to create jobs, their ability to create economic development. Because, as we know, so many of the humanitarian disasters, the humanitarian settings that we see today, that we keep funding with humanitarian aid year after year after year, are protracted humanitarian situations that actually are not in the need of more humanitarian aid. They're in the need of economic development. There are so many fragile states. If people will be willing to invest in the fragile state, invest in developing the economy, enabling people to actually bring their dignity back, to lift themselves out of poverty, we could have seen a very different situation than we see today. So engaging with the private sector should be about engaging the private sector to build the economy, not to talk about how they can provide another check for humanitarian relief work. That's, I think, is the biggest lost opportunity. And I'll come to a couple of examples in a moment, because there's several good examples of how that has been done, but not been scaled. But I think in order to make that happen, the UN, the NGOs, the humanitarian world would have to be able to understand how private sector operates and speak their language, just as the private sector needs to understand the concerns of the humanitarian sector. So that's the dialogue that needs to happen, and there's a learning that needs to happen, so we can see how we can widen the circle of contributors who actually work together to actually drive a better development in these sectors, in these communities that are really suffering and need some help to be lifted out of poverty. That dialogue is not necessarily happening. We're working in silos, and we have a private sector that doesn't get engaged. then you say, oh, this is very difficult because fragile sectors are really hard to invest in. Yes, they are. And businesses will look for the best possible opportunity to make money. That's what they should be doing. But there are ways that we can come together and de-risk investments for the private sector. So they will go and invest and drive development in an area that normally they wouldn't go. And that kind of de-risking is much cheaper than to continue to put humanitarian aid year after year after year and not doing anything to bring the dignity back to the people who are the receiver of that aid. So I think we have significant opportunities in this area. Let me give a couple examples, because in the 10 years I've been on the foundation side and not in the business, I've seen good examples. I've been part of good examples of this kind of development. That doesn't happen because organizations on a global basis are coming together and deciding to do things differently. No, it happens because individuals on the ground see an opportunity and they come together and put their heads together and they decide to stick their head out, take some risk, and think differently outside of the box, as you were referring to. If you look at the example of the development, the economic development in Kakuma Bay in the western part of Kenya, the refugee situation there has improved significantly thanks to the initiative of a creative UNHCR rep, creative sub-office leader, a creative governor in the Turkana region, and with good help from a very creative part who is responsible for fragile states for the International Finance Corporation. You know, this is a great example, could be scaled anywhere else, but it doesn't happen because it happened on the ground in spite of the system, and people looked at ways to just think differently and had a lot of fun doing that. Another example is when you look at a new initiative that UNHCR has put in place called the Green Financing Initiative Facility, Green Financing Facility. It's a fantastic initiative, totally out of the normal, enabling UNHCR to circumvent the problem that Jan was talking about, the one-year funding problem, to give them a facility that can replace the missing balance sheet that you have in a humanitarian organization because of the annual funding, and actually establish a facility that will enable UNHCR to green every operation around the world, take out the diesel generators and replace them with renewable energy, and have the private sector actually do that for them. Enables them to go to the private sector and give a guarantee, thanks to the help of Swedish government, German government, some foundations that help de-risk this investment. It's a totally different way of thinking. It's done by the private sector. It's not UNHCR operating it. UNHCR is putting together the facility that makes this happen. That's a great example how you can use the private sector in a different way than is normally happening. Third example, the World Economic Forum set up something called the Humanitarian Resilience Investment Initiative. The whole purpose of that platform is to match up good development projects in the humanitarian sector with impact investors who are willing to put money into these programs. If we can develop the programs, develop the ecosystem that enables an investable plan, there will be investors willing to come in with the money. This platform is unique and is another example of how we try to engage the private sector to give investment money into projects that can help lift community out of poverty. We have a great example of the Dutch government, the Dutch Prospect Program, which is a huge program that takes a much more holistic approach to making development happening in protracted humanitarian situations. It's quite interesting, it's quite out-of-the-box thinking, and it's really about driving the development as opposed to just continuing to push humanitarian aid into a region or a community. I can go on. We did a very interesting refugee humanitarian impact bond in Jordan to create jobs for refugee women and Jordanian women in the Jordan region. And it's something that we have private sector donors, we have governments, we have different partners in this program. And it's a different plan, but the whole idea is that you get more private capital in upfront in order to finance the development of something that otherwise wouldn't have happened. So there are lots of good examples. We need to take those examples and share them and scale them, because it's been done in many different situations, but there's no system that scales them and makes sure that this goes to the millions instead of just a few thousand.
So are you talking there about the work of the foundation, sort of enabling all these people, or who's coordinating all of that?
Well, in some cases we are engaged in this, and what foundations can do is quite unique. We can take huge risk. We can take huge risk and we can fail, and it has no consequences. So we should take that unique capital that comes out of philanthropic institutions, and we should invest it against developing new approaches, new models that we can test, we can learn from, and we can capture, we can evaluate, and we can put into a structure where we can attract others who can scale it up. We can take the upfront risk and test the new model. We can evaluate that and find out what works, what doesn't work, and we can share that with our partners who will then take it to the next level. The kind of programs that others wouldn't really risk doing because it's just has too big an opportunity to fail. We are very happy to take that risk if we think the upside is huge, and that's what foundations should do. We will then capture that in a learning structure, and we would share it with others, and then we can go on and take another risk somewhere else.
Thank you. So you can take the bigger risks. That's very interesting. I don't know, perhaps one of you could answer. The huge amount of money that foundations collectively give away in philanthropy, they give grants, and it's almost one or two like countries, the amount of money they give. Does that come in the donor index? Is that part of does that go towards, say, the US being the 80%? Do you know if that's actually collected in that, or does the donor index just look at countries and GDP? Yeah, so that is a huge source of funding there. Yeah, Jan, I saw you nodding away when Per Heggenes was talking, and yourself. Would you like to come in there at all?
Diana. No, I think there's been good examples from all of us of doing new and innovative work in different places. I like, Ute, when you say that there are international financial institutions now working with national governments to try to make plans to get out of the dependency and the misery, really. I hope it's not going to be a debt bomb long term, that it would be grants, but that's an excellent example. And Per, certainly the foundations, the private capital, the Gates Foundation, the vaccines, there are a lot of fantastic things that has happened of late. Much of that happens in countries that are not those in free fall, where we are now struggling. I mean, I'm talking Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Myanmar, Afghans in Iran, Sahel, Northeast Nigeria. There are listed terrorist organizations. They are under sanctions. The private sector doesn't want to work with us because there is not even bank transfers functioning in the place. The donors are potentially partisan to the conflicts there. They could provide arms to our situation. It varies from place to place, and I'd like to use this opportunity here in Brussels to say it's remarkable that still a lot of European countries, and including the European Union, still have no humanitarian exemption in their sanctions regimes. Even the United States now has done it. We're not even doing it yet in Europe. And it's holding us back. We're not getting new donors, and we're not getting the private sector in. So we have to have plans for each country, for each category of countries. And the countries that worry me most are the comprehensive emergencies with conflict on top of climate change, on top of sanctions, on top of bad governance.
Thank you. I'm going to bring some questions shortly from the audience. Diana, did you want to say something? Then we'll go along. Everyone just give 1 minute, please, and then I want to bring the audience in.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. No, it was very interesting to listen to you, Per. I think, well, if we broaden it a bit, I think in development cooperation, the whole idea is poverty eradication, and what gives that more than, well, you can approach that in many ways, but obviously economic growth will always be a core foundation, and what is better on that than private businesses and capital. That's what you do. But when I listen to you and I hear this, well, there are a lot of pilot projects and things that can be done on a smaller scale, but problem arises when you try to scale them up, where there is always a problem. And then I will stick my neck out and think, is it also because partly the rule book we have for how we can use humanitarian funding and development funding is written for not engaging with private capital? Because at least now when we look at, from the Swedish side, we try to see how we can involve businesses more, and I think it will be extremely important. I think we all agree on that when it comes to rebuilding Ukraine. Then again and again we run into some practical problems, such as like, oh, there's competition rules, there is this and that can't be counted as DAC, etc., etc. So there is also maybe I don't know, a reason to look at the rule book. Do we need to also rewrite some of the rules in order to actually be better at partnering with private sector? That was my reflection.
Thank you. Dr. Al-Arabiya, briefly, thank you.
I'll do just quick comments. One on what Ian has mentioned regarding the compulsory 0.7. It's easier said than done. We know the practicality of it may not happen, but I'll go back to what I have said at the beginning. Selective taxation that can be done. I know the rules are difficult, but we have to modify the rules. What Ati has mentioned, and I want to combine what Ati and Per has mentioned, I think it's an opportunity if the rules will allow that there will be a private UN and also countries like Pakistan and others move from dependency to being self-sufficient, provided that there is a determined government that will allow that. We have an experience by Al-Rajhi Foundation in Saudi Arabia in Sudan for the agriculture, but the change of government, corruption, and others has probably limited that. I'll conclude by saying that also in KS Relief, we are moving to something which is new, with partnership with the private sector. We are actually opening endowments as a partnership and also opening investment with the private sector. We want something that we generate money, something sustainable, so we want to open it. We are going to pass a regulation and a law that allows KS Relief to partner with the private sector in endowments and co-investment.
Okay, Uti, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, Per, I wanted to provoke you a little bit because you said something very, very important. Don't ask us about money. We are not asking you about money, but we are also not coming together, no? That's for us a challenge, because Jan, exactly what you're saying, in these countries, South Sudan, no? Lebanon, Yemen, Afghanistan, northeast Nigeria, there is no foreign direct investment. You are telling me you can de-risk. And we are still, not getting into that kind of thinking out of the box with the private sector. So I'm not asking you about money, but what we can do is formulating what we need. We want to bring down our operational costs. We want to drive for the best innovative solutions, airdrops in South Sudan. That's the most expensive what you can do in the humanitarian system. But in the moment, we are more innovative and more precise, in our airdrops. We can save up to 30% of our operational costs. How to use blockchain for our truck fleet management, how to use blockchain for our cash-based transfers. We need you on that side. And I don't know how I could in a way reach you. Are we not clear enough in terms of formulation what we need? Because you have said, in addition, what you can bring to the table is a solution where you can say you can de-risk, and all the kind of the bar in terms of compliance and on your side, is not so high. So your ability to engage in the most innovative test lab, is tremendously high, and I would really appreciate getting you into our most into our most fragile settings and saying, can you please help us bringing down operational costs or really innovate work towards the best innovative solution?
I'm going to get the answer from Per to be a bit later, because I need to open the floor now to some questions from these, so we can all hold our breath, and perhaps at the end, Per, you can say yes or no. But can we please take some questions, and I'm going to stand up so I can see who you are, and maybe, yes, there's two there. Mics to these two, we'll take three, so one there, one next to them, and is there another one we can get a mic to later? Right at the back there. Stand up so we can see you. We can't see you. I can just, yeah. So there's a mic needs to go there. Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and also important conversation in the times that we are in. My name is Isabella Olsson, and I work for Elm International, a Swedish society organization. And my question is, how can humanitarian donors better stimulate joint interventions and collaboration between the private sector and the civil society in regards to ensuring that we break silos so that these actors can actually work more together to stimulate these?
Okay, so
Thank you.
We'll take another question. There was someone next to you. Ooh. There we are, number two.
Thank you. My name is Emma, and I work for an organisation called the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, so I'm not a neutral person in this area. We've been working with the Swedish presidency on them promoting this idea that we do have to diversify funding, and we cannot have finite humanitarian funds paying for everything. I think obviously the organisation I work for, we see anticipatory action as one of the ways that we can do this, and we see it as something that needs to be mainstreamed across climate and development. Investments that are made in climate and development have a huge impact on the degree to which we're able to respond and what we need to respond to. And I think that, yes, we need more humanitarian finance and we need more humanitarian donors, but that's really only part of a very complex picture. We need to urgently address the issue that for the large part, climate and development investments are made in a relatively risk-blind way. We talk about things like shock-responsive social protection as if everything doesn't need to be shock-responsive, particularly within the context of climate change. So I think humanitarian response should be the last resort. We want to stop people getting into acute humanitarian needs if possible, and preparedness, anticipation, resilience, climate. Everybody has a role to play there. And I think that diversifying funding portfolios is really important. I think it's important for donors to look within their own portfolios and look at how they could make more coherent and sensible investments. I know that many donors acknowledge the fact that their climate development, early warning and humanitarian investments are
Can I just interrupt and ask if you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question. I just want to say, I think it's great to diversify, but also not at the expense of the governments and communities who are affected. We don't always have to be a middleman, and we don't always need to have our cut. International humanitarian response is extremely expensive, and some of the reasons for that are more within our control than we would like to admit, which is the staffing costs and things like that. So I don't think we want to be talking about localization out of one side of our mouth, while at the other side negotiating against the interests of governments and communities to take money that should more directly go to them. So I would love to hear from some or all of the panelists about how are we actually supporting governments and communities to respond or to have their own humanitarian capacity or to increase their resilience. So we're not just involved in the humanitarian bottom line, we're actually thinking about capacity and needs-based and locally led approaches on the ground. Thanks.
Thank you. And there was one question at the back. Can you stand up again, please, and raise your hand if you want to ask a question still? Yep, and there's one at the front here as well, and then that's it.
I'll be brief. My name is Kenneth Kader. I'm from Haiti. Thank you for the panel of discussion. I think it's really important. I like the idea of portfolio diversification, but it wasn't clear for me if it's an increase in portfolio. I would like to have an explanation about that, because I know some of the time the fund, the IMF or World Bank fund, they could be used for more, to tackle more structural issues in this country, like building school or other infrastructure that could have made some of the most vulnerable community more resilient. So if the diversification is not associated with a kind of increase in portfolio, I'm concerned that we will fall in a kind of cycle where we no longer have money to invest in infrastructure to increase the resilience of the people because we are using the money for humanitarian purpose. So I would like to have a clarification on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So there's one question at the front here, but we will start answering just in the interest of time. So, Uti, would you like to talk about the diversification of portfolio?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is additional money, made available by IMF, in particular in the case for Haiti, but also, as I said, 30 billion in addition was allocated from the World Bank to address global food security. And I think it's also on us really, flagging the issue that global food security has to be a very high, on the political agenda just to get it going. And this is why we are so in appreciation also for the Global Alliance of Food Security. There are a lot of, political initiatives out there helping, and also helping national governments to take the right decisions. And it's not on us to say you should do that, but it's also, what I said, the national governments should really weigh up the pros and cons, and that's part of the comment or stroke question. What are we doing with engaging in the smart investment in terms of resilience, climate adaptation? That's the whole transformation journey we are going through is the World Food Programme, because we are so convinced, and we know that in the moment we invest in climate resilient or climate friendly infrastructure, if we are coming up with climate adaptation solutions, we are saving a lot of humanitarian funds needed. That's the way to go.
Thank you. I'll just take one question from the front, and then we'll collate them and answer.
Thank you very much for this interesting and thought-provoking conversation. I'd like to come back. By the way, my name is Jacques Boucher. I'm an independent philanthropy advisor. And I'd like to come back to Ute's question to Per, because I've attended many fora and conferences about public-private partnership. And here we have now a Deputy General Executive Director of the World Food Programme asking to the IKEA Foundation to help them out on a public stage. So my question to you both is, why is it that not so many private-public partnerships, are concretely realized? I would like to have, is it a corporate culture? Is it a different kind of working procedures? I'd like to find out, because we're talking for many years now about public-private partnership, and there's so less results. Thank you very much.
Okay, Per, would you like to perhaps give your perspective?
Well, first of all, I think we're talking about two different worlds. We have the world of the UN and the NGOs and the governments who are used to being in charge of humanitarian aid, and then we have the world of business, and they don't talk to each other. So I think finding ways to start that dialogue and do what I said, understand each other better, to look for opportunities to collaborate and think differently and widen the circle of collaborators in providing out-of-the-box solutions is the first thing. Now, when I talk about the private sector, I want to remind everyone that I don't necessarily think about the IKEAs or the Unilevers or the MasterCards of the world. I think about the private sector in the local community where we have a humanitarian situation where we look for opportunities to engage them locally, not necessarily international companies, but local companies that have the opportunity to help drive the economic development in that community if they get the incentive to do that, if they come together with the UN, with the civil society, with the organizations, with the government, and create a platform for engagement and maybe an opportunity for de-risking. Because we, again, foundations, and we have done that several times, we de-risk investments, because if we de-risk investments, let's say we take a first loss, as they say in the financial world, of 10%, we can add 10 times the amount of funding to an initiative that otherwise we would have done on our own. So philanthropic funding is quite unique, and is a quite unique type of capital. And if we can leverage that capital, we can do so much more than otherwise it would be the case. But I think to your question, it's about finding together and starting to have a dialogue. I also think it's about having more private sector people joining your types of organization and vice versa, because that will help increase the dialogue. And some of the examples I have seen in humanitarian and UN organization where really good private sector collaboration has started. It's happened because different people, the unusual people have been brought onto the team and they think differently. And I see more and more of that happening, and that makes me very happy.
Thank you. Let's go to another question. I'd like to bring in perhaps Diana Janse and also Dr. Al-Rabia perhaps to answer this. So how can humanitarian donors stimulate joint initiatives between the private sector and civil society? What can donors be doing to kind of engage people?
Do you want to start?
No. Ladies first.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, I seriously struggle with this a lot on how to go about this, because it's on paper it seems quite, I mean, I think we all agree that it's logical, etc. But in practice it turns out to be quite problematic, and not because of the lack of interest from the private sector, or it's just that we're unused to this and we just don't have really the toolbox to realize it in we have some of the tools, others I think we lack. I mean, there are many successful partnerships we do, and we work a lot with guarantees and grants, etc.
Diana, could you hold the microphone just?
Yeah, sorry. We work a lot with guarantees and grants, etc. in order to support private businesses. But when it comes to, for instance, now when we look at Ukraine, how we can, there are a lot of interest among Swedish businesses and private sector to both to support and help, but also to be part of the rebuilding of Ukraine. Then we quickly run into some practical problems. For instance, like I bring out one very practical, which is export credit guarantees that do not work in. I mean, the Swedish authorities responsible for this cannot operate in Ukraine as it is, given the rule book. So then you have to rewrite it or have a special set of rules for Ukraine. And then, okay, so where do you get that money from? You can take it from development money, but then not everything Swedish companies that come into Ukraine to rebuild Ukraine will be eligible for getting these then credit guarantees, and if they default, because it's not what they do is not within the rules of what can be funded by development funding. So there are a lot of practical things like that. But I certainly do not have any answers. I mean, I can only say that we spend a lot of time thinking and sort of how can we do this better? How can we broaden how can we scale up what we do that is working? But also how can we get into these areas where we obviously do not sit with the tools or the answers?
Thank you. Well, we are actually we've got 30 seconds left, so I'm afraid I'm not going to ask anyone for any more thoughts or interventions, but I think we've heard a lot about thinking outside the box and absolutely rewriting the rule book, and also perhaps a new partnership emerging at that side of the room. Who knows? But it's wonderful to have a real private sector representative taking part in a discussion like this, and much more can be done. And I'd also like to thank our graphic artist who has, again, summarized the discussions there. So that just leaves me to thank the panelists for your very good and concrete ideas. Round of applause, please.